It was a September evening in 2023 in the quiet neighbourhood of Hampstead in London, when James Mitchell, 34 years old, opened his front door for his first blind date in 3 years. On the other side of the threshold stood Sarah Thompson, a stunning 29-year-old woman with blonde hair and a smile that hid 1,000 secrets. But when she nervously whispered, "My children are in the car," pointing to a Ford Focus parked under the street lamp, James felt his world collapse. 2 children looked at him through the rear windows with curious and frightened eyes. What happened in the next 10 minutes not only shattered an evening that was meant to be simple, but revealed a truth so incredible that both had to grip the wall to keep from falling. A truth that concerned them long before they met, and that would forever change 4 innocent lives. James Mitchell looked at himself in the bathroom mirror one last time, adjusting the checked shirt that his 8-year-old daughter Sophie had chosen for him that morning with the seriousness of a professional stylist. In the Victorian terraced house in Hampstead that he shared with Sophie and his 6-year-old son Oliver, everything was perfectly organized for the evening. The children were at their maternal grandparents' for the first time in months. The house had been obsessively cleaned, every toy put in its place, and even the sofa had been freed from the eternally crooked cushions that characterized their daily life. For the first time in 3 years since becoming a widower, James had accepted a blind date. The decision hadn't come easily. After his wife Charlotte's death in that car accident that changed everything, James had devoted himself completely to the children, transforming overnight from a loving husband to a single father. The first weeks had been a nightmare of nappies, nighttime bottles, tears from children calling for Mummy, who would never come back again, and his own despair that he tried to hide behind forced smiles and made-up songs. With time, he had found a routine that worked. Mornings began at 6 with breakfast preparation. Sophie preferred cereal with cold milk. Oliver always wanted jam right to the edges of his toast. Then came the race to dress them, comb their hair, find rucksacks, exercise books, and that sock that mysteriously disappeared every morning. His work as a software engineer offered flexibility, but evenings were always the same: dinner, bath, bedtime stories, and then that heavy loneliness that descended on the house like a blanket too thick. It was in those silent hours, when the children slept and the house became too big and too empty, that James felt the weight of everything he had lost. Not just Charlotte, but also the possibility of sharing the children's small daily victories, worries about a cold that wouldn't go away, the joy of watching Sophie learn to read, or Oliver finally managing to tie his shoelaces by himself. Their mutual friend Helen had been talking to him about Sarah for months, with that sweet but relentless persistence of women who believe in love even when those directly involved have stopped believing. Sarah Thompson, pediatrician at Great Ormond Street Hospital, 30 years old, had been through a difficult time but was ready for a fresh start. Helen had organized casual encounters at the playground, group lunches where strangely Sarah was always invited, and endless conversations where Sarah's name came up with suspicious frequency. James had resisted for months. He wasn't ready, he said. The children needed stability, he said. And then there was the fear he wouldn't even confess to himself. The fear of betraying Charlotte's memory, of replacing her, of allowing someone else to occupy that sacred space she had left. But above all, the fear of suffering again, of opening his heart and risking losing it a second time. That evening, as he ran his hands through hair still thick, but with some gray strands that hadn't been there before the tragedy, James thought about what had finally convinced him to accept. It had been Sophie's birthday the week before. As she blew out the candles and made a secret wish, James had noticed how her eyes had lingered on the complete families around the party table. Mums and dads who smiled at each other, who naturally shared tasks, who seemed to have a completeness that they lacked. That evening, as Sophie fell asleep, she had whispered something that broke his heart. She hoped Daddy wouldn't always be so sad, and that maybe one day they could be happy again, like in the photos when Mummy was there. James had understood that his loneliness wasn't just damaging him, but his children too. At 7:30 p.m. sharp, the doorbell rang. James opened the door, and the first thought that crossed his mind was that the photos Helen had shown him didn't do Sarah Thompson justice. She was even more beautiful than described, wavy blonde hair that caught the golden light of the London sunset, deep green eyes that seemed to contain stories not yet told, an elegant but not too formal beige dress that suggested a woman who knew how to dress without showing off. But there was something else, something that went beyond the first aesthetic impression. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that James recognized immediately, because it was the same one he saw in the mirror every morning. It was the vulnerability of someone who had suffered, who was putting themselves back in the game despite the fear, who hoped but had learned not to expect too much from life. The way Sarah nervously twisted her hands, how she gently bit her lower lip, how her eyes moved quickly between his face and the street behind him, betrayed an agitation that went far beyond normal first-date nerves. Something wasn't right. James felt it in the air like electricity before a storm. After the initial greetings, full of that slightly formal politeness that characterizes encounters between strangers who know they've been brought together by well-meaning friends, Sarah did something unexpected. Instead of smiling and saying she was ready to go to the restaurant they had chosen, she lowered her gaze, took a deep breath like someone preparing to dive into cold water, and then looked at him with an expression that mixed courage and absolute terror. The words she spoke changed the entire course of the evening and, without them knowing it yet, of their lives. She had her children in the car. James felt the words hit him like a punch to the stomach. He automatically followed her gaze to the street, where a gray Ford Focus was parked under the street lamp that was beginning to light up in the London twilight. Through the rear windows he could clearly see two small silhouettes, a boy and a girl who watched them with that intense seriousness that children have when waiting for adults to decide their fate. Sarah, with tears beginning to glisten in her eyes under the porch light, began to explain with a trembling voice. They were 6-year-old twins, Ben and Lucy. Her ex-husband had disappeared 6 months earlier, without explanations, without an address where he could be found, without even a phone call to know how his children were. She worked 12 hours a day at the hospital, did night shifts when necessary, and that evening the childminder who was supposed to come had fallen ill at the last moment. Sarah told, increasingly quickly like someone who knows they're confessing something unforgivable, that she had needed this date so much to feel like a woman again and not just an exhausted mother, that she had thought of bringing the children and leaving them in the car during a quick coffee. She knew it was wrong, she knew it was dangerous, she knew it was terrible mothering, but after 6 months of absolute loneliness, the idea of canceling the only date she'd had in years seemed unbearable. She called herself a terrible mother, beginning to cry openly, apologizing for ruining the evening, for putting James in an impossible situation, for being the stupidest woman in the world. James watched her cry and felt something in his chest move in an unexpected way. It wasn't irritation at the unexpected situation, not annoyance at the ruined date, not even surprise at the absurdity of the situation. It was pure, deep, visceral empathy. It was the recognition of a single parent looking at another single parent and seeing reflected their own daily desperation, their own loneliness, their own tiredness of always having to be strong for the children without ever being able to be vulnerable with someone. James looked again towards the car, where the two children waited patiently with that silent dignity that children develop when life forces them to grow up too quickly. In that moment, instead of doing what common sense and politeness suggested, apologizing politely, saying it might be better to postpone, gently closing the door and returning to his solitary evening, James did something that surprised even himself, something that came from a part of him he had forgotten he possessed. That part Charlotte had always loved most about him, his ability to be spontaneously kind, to put others' needs before his own comfort. He invited Sarah to get the children and bring them into the house. He had made spaghetti bolognese for dinner. He joked with a surprisingly natural smile. There was enough for a small army. And if the children didn't like spaghetti bolognese, he always had an emergency supply of plain pasta with butter and cheese that Sophie and Oliver considered food of the gods. Sarah looked at him as if he had just performed a miracle, as if instead of complicating her evening he had saved her from disaster. The tears in her eyes changed quality, from tears of shame and desperation to tears of relief and gratitude. What neither of them knew, as they walked together towards that gray Ford Focus under the street lamp, was that when they brought Ben and Lucy into that house, a secret hidden for years would emerge with the force of an emotional tsunami. A secret that concerned not just the two adults getting to know each other, but all four children involved. A secret that would prove that sometimes fate has a cruel sense of irony, but also a capacity for healing that goes beyond any human understanding. James and Sarah walked together to the car, the two children observing them with that particular seriousness of little ones who have had to grow up too fast. Ben studied James with intelligent dark eyes before accepting the invitation, while Lucy shyly hid behind Sarah's legs. Entering the house, the twins looked around with cautious curiosity. The house was warm and lived in, drawings on the fridge, family photos everywhere. Lucy immediately noticed a photo of Sophie and Oliver on the table, discovering that James also had children their age who were at their grandparents' that evening. When James explained that their mummy had died 3 years earlier,
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Ben replied seriously that their daddy wasn't there anymore either, but had simply gone away. Lucy was the first to notice something strange while looking at the drawings on the fridge. The signature, Oliver Mitchell, Year 1, St. Mary's Primary School. Sarah paled. Ben and Lucy also went to St. Mary's Primary in Year 1. But the real bombshell exploded when they exchanged surnames. The twins were also called Mitchell. The truth emerged painfully. Sarah's ex-husband, who had abandoned her and the children 6 months earlier, was called David Mitchell. James felt the world spin around him. David was his wife Charlotte's younger brother, the brother he hadn't seen for 3 years, disappeared just when they needed family most. David had never told Sarah about Sophie and Oliver, claiming his family was dead or that he had cut off relations. He had convinced Sarah it was better to start fresh without the burden of the past. James realized the horrible truth. Ben and Lucy were Charlotte's nephews, Sophie and Oliver's cousins. David had abandoned both families, robbing the children of the chance to know each other. Dinner transformed into a delicate reconstruction of the past. James told how David had come to Charlotte's funeral when the children were devastated. Oliver was only 3, Sophie 5. David had promised to be there, to help them remember Mummy. Then he vanished, never calling again. Sarah discovered that when they married in 2018, David had lied about his family, claiming it was better to start fresh. The children listened with that innocent wisdom that sometimes surpasses that of adults. When Lucy asked why Daddy had lied, Sarah tried to explain that sometimes people run from pain instead of facing it. David had loved Aunt Charlotte very much, and when she died, instead of staying close to the family to remember her together, he preferred to pretend she had never existed. James got a photo album and showed the twins photos of Charlotte and James's wedding in 2012. In the front row, next to the couple, stood David, younger, smiling, his arm around Charlotte. He seemed a different man from the one Sarah had married. In later photos, there were barbecues, birthdays, Christmases with David playing with little Sophie, laughing with Charlotte. Ben stared at the photos with huge eyes, asking if that lady was really their aunt. James confirmed, explaining that Sophie and Oliver in the photos were their cousins. Lucy's question about why Daddy had never told them echoed painfully in the room. The four sitting around the kitchen table realized they had all been victims of the same person. David had robbed his children of their extended family, deprived Sophie and Oliver of their cousins, denied James and Sarah the mutual support they both desperately needed. The next Saturday, James decided to bring all four children together, knowing they were cousins. Sophie and Oliver returned home full of curiosity, and James explained to them gently that they had discovered they had cousins living in London. When Sarah arrived with the twins, the atmosphere was electric with nervousness and expectation. The four children studied each other from the living room like little diplomats evaluating a peace treaty. Lucy broke the ice by approaching Sophie's drawings and complimenting her artistic skill. Sophie, proud of the compliment, immediately offered to teach her to draw. Meanwhile, Oliver and Ben had approached the PlayStation with the universal interest of 6-year-old boys for video games. James and Sarah smiled from the kitchen, watching the children do what they always did: adapt with an ease that adults could only envy. The real magical moment came in the afternoon, when Sophie made a decision that surprised everyone. She went to her room and returned with her most precious possession, a teddy bear that Charlotte had given her shortly before her death. She gave it to Lucy, explaining that it was from Mummy, and so she would also have something from Aunt Charlotte. Sarah had to step outside to hide her tears. The four children were spontaneously healing wounds they didn't even know they had. A month had passed, and the two families had naturally merged into a routine that seemed to have existed forever. Weekends at James's house, weekday dinners at Sarah's in Camden, children often sleeping over at each other's houses. Sophie had taken on the role of protective big sister. Oliver and Ben had become inseparable, and Lucy had found in James a father figure she didn't know she wanted. James and Sarah were navigating the complicated waters of a relationship born under the most unusual circumstances. It hadn't been love at first sight from romantic films, but something deeper, a mutual understanding born from sharing pain and parental responsibility. It was a Sunday evening in October when everything changed again. The children were watching a film in the living room, Sarah was helping with maths homework, and James was making tea when the doorbell rang. He opened the door without looking through the peephole and found himself face to face with David Mitchell. Charlotte's brother had changed, thinner, with deep, dark circles, crumpled clothes suggesting difficult days. But his eyes were the same, those of the Mitchell family that James knew so well. When Ben asked who was at the door, David heard his son's voice, and his face contorted in pure pain. Sarah appeared behind James, turning marble white at the sight of the man who had abandoned her. The children approached the entrance, and when the twins saw David, time seemed to stop. Lucy whispered a "Daddy?" in a tiny voice, but Ben stepped back, instinctively protecting his sister. With the firmness of his 6 years, he asked his father where he had been, telling how Mummy had cried every night and Lucy had had nightmares. David began to cry, explaining he had been in a rehabilitation clinic. Drugs, alcohol, gambling addiction. After leaving the family, he had completely collapsed, losing everything. He had been clean for 3 months, had a new job, and had understood that running from pain didn't make it disappear, but only made it worse. David looked at James, explaining that after Charlotte's death, he couldn't look at Sophie and Oliver without seeing her, couldn't be in that house without feeling her absence. He had believed that starting fresh with Sarah meant erasing the past, but the past had caught up with them anyway. Lucy bravely approached, asking if he was really healed. David looked into her eyes, promising he was trying to be, that every day was a battle but he was learning to fight. Ben, still skeptical, asked what would happen if he left again. David replied that even if he should relapse, they now had a family that would protect them: James, Sophie, and Oliver. 3 months after that confrontation, it was Christmas. In the terraced house in Hampstead, decorated with the chaotic enthusiasm of 4 children and 3 adults, learning what it meant to be a non-traditional family, the most important meal of their lives was being prepared. David had slowly returned to the children's lives. First supervised visits, then shared afternoons, finally occasional weekends. He was a different man, more fragile, but more honest, more present, but more aware of the fragility of his presence. He sat on the sofa reading Lucy A Christmas Story, while Ben, still cautious but increasingly open, helped James in the kitchen. Sarah observed the scene, still incredulous about how things had worked out. When Ben asked if James and his children would remain their family even if Daddy came back to live with them, Sarah explained that family wasn't like clothing you wear one at a time. Family can grow. James and his children would always be their family, whatever happened with Daddy. That afternoon, on the balcony, David had a decisive conversation with Sarah. He told her he wouldn't return to live with them. The children were well there, she was well there, and he still had too much road ahead before he could be the father and husband they deserved. Seeing James teaching Ben how to cut vegetables, David recognized that James was a better man than him, and that they deserved the best. David explained that being a father didn't mean owning one's children, but loving them enough to let them be free to be happy. He wanted the divorce, and wanted Sarah to marry James. It was the only right thing he could do after all the mistakes. That evening, after the presents had been opened and the children had gone to bed, James and Sarah sat, exhausted but happy, on the sofa. David had returned to his small flat near the hospital, close enough to see the children regularly, but far enough not to complicate the new family dynamic. Sarah looked at the family photos scattered on the coffee table, which now included all 6 members of their extended family. She saw Sundays like this one: Sophie, who would later teach Lucy to put on makeup; Oliver and Ben, who would argue over the PlayStation; David, who would come to school concerts and birthdays. From the children's rooms came excited voices. They all knew that James and Sarah had to get married, it was obvious. The children were once again 3 steps ahead of the adults. James and Sarah looked at each other and burst into laughter. Their future had already been decided by the most important people in the world. In that terraced house in Hampstead, a family born under the most unlikely circumstances had found its happy ending. Not perfect, not without complications, but real, honest, and full of love that had grown not despite the difficulties, but precisely because of them. Because sometimes the best families aren't the ones that are born, but the ones that are chosen. If this story made you believe that the most beautiful families are the ones we choose, leave a like. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever experienced a similar situation? Do you believe love can truly heal the wounds of the past? What's your definition of family? Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that prove sometimes the most casual encounters lead to the most beautiful destinies. Share this story with someone who needs to believe that every ending can be a new beginning. Remember, family isn't just blood, it's love, support, and the daily choice to be there for each other.